He inherited the greatest empire in human history from the greatest emperor who ever lived. His father left him a machine of perfection, loyal armies, a functioning senate, a civilization at its peak. Marcus Aurelius spent his entire reign holding the world together with philosophy and iron discipline. And then he handed it to his son. Within months, the killings began. Not enemies, not barbarians, family, allies, anyone who had been close to his mother. The list grew quietly at first, a name here, a name there, until it wasn't quiet anymore. He renamed the months of the calendar after himself, all 12 of them. He renamed the city of Rome. He renamed the Senate. He walked into the Colosseum, not to watch but to fight, and declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules on earth. And the Senate applauded, because the ones who didn't disappeared. But here is what the movie never showed you. The madness had a pattern, the chaos had an architect, and the three people who finally decided to kill him, his mistress, his wrestling partner, and his closest advisor, were not heroes. They were just next on the list. This is the real Commodus, and it is so much worse than the film. Marcus Aurelius did not want to be emperor. He wanted to read, to write, to sit in a cold room before dawn and work through the geometry of a good life with nothing but a candle and a blank page. Power, he believed, was a burden handed to those strong enough to carry it without enjoying it. He carried it for 19 years, and every single day of those 19 years, his son watched him. Commodus grew up inside the machinery of the greatest government the ancient world had ever produced. He sat beside his father in audiences. He watched his father negotiate with barbarian kings, mediate between senators, deny himself luxury that would have made lesser men weep with gratitude. He watched a man who could have anything choose almost nothing. What does that do to a child? Not inspiration, not reverence, something colder, something that festers in the gap between who your father is and who you already know you are not. By the time Commodus was 16, Marcus had named him co-emperor. The old man was dying by degrees on the northern frontier, his body surrendering what his mind refused to. He believed his son would continue the work. He was wrong in a way that would cost Rome a generation. The moment Marcus Aurelius closed his eyes for the last time, Commodus turned south toward Rome and never looked back at the frontier again. The work was over. Something else was beginning. The bodies started appearing before anyone understood what was happening. Not on battlefields, not in public executions, in bedrooms, in private gardens, in the kind of quiet places where powerful people feel safe enough to stop watching their backs. Commodus did not announce his purge. He did not stand before the Senate and name enemies. He worked the way a man works when he has learned that the most dangerous predators make no sound before they strike. His mother Faustina was already dead. She had died on the frontier the year before his father. But her circle remained, her friends, her confidants, the women and men who had whispered in her ear and through her into the ear of Marcus himself. They had shaped the empire from its soft interior for decades. Commodus knew exactly who they were. The first name on the list was Seoterus, his own favorite, his own man, killed by the Praetorian prefect Perennis. Whether on Commodus's order or with his quiet permission, the sources disagree. It does not matter. The effect was identical. Then came the conspiracy of 182. His own sister Lucilla, convinced her brother was destroying everything their father built, organized a group of senators to assassinate him. The attempt failed. The assassin hesitated at the last moment. Legend says he stopped to announce himself before striking. That moment of vanity cost him everything. Commodus executed the conspirators slowly, then their families, then anyone who had known them well enough to grieve. The list had found its appetite. It began with the club, a golden one, carried openly through the palace corridors, then into Senate meetings, then into public appearances. Heavy, ornate, unmistakable. The weapon of one figure and one figure only in the Roman imagination. Hercules. Commodus did not wake up one morning and decide he was a god. It grew the way all delusions grow, incrementally, fed by the silence of people too afraid to push back. First the club, then the lion skin draped over imperial robes, then the official portraits changed, then the coins. By 191 AD, the transformation was complete and codified. Commodus issued a formal decree. He was no longer the emperor of Rome. He was Hercules Romanus, the Roman Hercules, the earthly embodiment of the divine hero descended to cleanse the world of its enemies. The priests had to agree. The Senate had to agree. The historians recording events in real time had to use the new name or face consequences they understood very well by now. But here is what gets lost in the spectacle of the lion skin and the golden club. This was not performance for its own sake. Every time a senator bent his knee to Hercules instead of to an emperor, he was surrendering something. Every ceremony that required acknowledgement of Commodus's divinity was a loyalty test with a body count attached to failure. The madness was the architecture. The god costume was the most efficient surveillance system in Rome. The crowd did not know how to feel. On one side of the Colosseum, the senators sat in their designated marble seats, togas pressed, faces arranged into expressions of careful enthusiasm. They had been told to attend. They had been told to cheer. Several of them had been told specifically what to shout and when. Below them, in the sand, the emperor of Rome was killing things. Commodus had been training for years in private. The wrestling bouts, the weapons practice, the hours in the palace gymnasium, none of it was vanity. He was genuinely skilled, genuinely fast, and he had designed a system that made his performance impossible to lose. The opponents were selected in advance. Wounded men, one-legged veterans brought in from the street, animals that had been starved into weakness. On some occasions, men whose legs had been bound before they were pushed into the arena so that Commodus could fight from horseback against someone who could not run. He won every bout, obviously. And after each victory, he stood in the sand and looked up at the senators and waited. And the senators, every one of them, rose to their feet and cheered the Hercules of Rome. One senator, Dio Cassius, who was there and wrote it down, describes chewing on laurel leaves from his own wreath to stop himself from laughing, because the alternative to laughter was tears, and the alternative to tears was the list. The games went on for days. Commodus charged the city of Rome 1 million sesterces per appearance. The Senate paid. The decree arrived without warning. Every senator in Rome received it on the same morning, carried by the same imperial messengers moving through the city in coordinated silence. They unrolled their scrolls and read the same words at roughly the same hour, in their homes and their offices and their private gardens. The city of Rome had been renamed. It was now Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. The months of the year had been renamed. All 12 of them now bore variations of the emperor's names and titles: Lucius, Aelius, Aurelius, Commodus, Augustus, Herculeus, Romanus, Exuperatorius, Amazonius, Invictus, Felix, Pius. And the Senate itself, the institution that traced its lineage back 7 centuries to the founding of the Republic, had been renamed. It was now the Commodian Fortunate Senate. 900 men had their identities absorbed into a single name. The senators read their scrolls. They set them down. They went to the next session and used the new names. They referred to the city correctly. They dated their documents according to the new calendar. Not one of them refused publicly. This is the thing about sophisticated tyranny that simpler histories miss. The cruelty was not just in the killing, it was in the participation. Every senator who used the new name became, in some small but irreversible way, an instrument of the system that humiliated him. Commodus did not just want their obedience, he wanted their collaboration. Her name was Marcia. She had been in the palace long enough to understand its architecture, not the marble and the columns, but the invisible structure underneath. Who reported to whom? Which freedman carried which secret? where the pressure points were and how hard you could push before something broke. She was the emperor's favorite, which meant she was simultaneously the most protected and the most endangered person in Rome. Favor could end between one breath and the next, and everyone in the palace had watched it happen to others. She managed the relationship with the precision of someone who understood that love, in this palace, was a resource to be rationed carefully. For years, the arrangement held. Then one evening, she found a wax tablet. The sources vary on the details, whether she was looking for it, whether a servant brought it, whether she found it by accident. What they agree on is what she read. A list of names, in Commodus's own handwriting, scheduled for execution. Her name was on it. She read it once. She set it down. She sat in the silence of the room for a moment that the historians cannot measure, but every human being can imagine. The moment when the architecture you have been living inside reveals its true purpose. Then she sent for two men, Eclectus, the chamberlain, and Narcissus, the emperor's wrestling trainer. She told them what she had read. She told them their own names were also on the list. The meeting was very short. They chose New Year's Eve. The symbolism was probably not lost on Marcia. The last night of the year, the last night of the calendar that bore 12 variations of his name. One final evening of Colonia Commodiana before the world tried, quietly and desperately, to become something else. She poured the poison into his wine herself. Commodus drank. He ate. He continued the evening's entertainments. And then, somewhere in the hours that followed, his body began to reject what she had given him. He vomited, violently, repeatedly. The poison was leaving his system. Marcia stood somewhere in the palace and understood what this meant. A failed assassination attempt, discovered, had exactly one outcome in Commodus's Rome. She had watched it happen to others. She had read enough names on enough lists to know precisely what came next. There was no going back. There was only forward, or the list. She sent for Narcissus. He was a wrestler by profession, a man whose entire discipline was built around the mechanics of the human body, its leverage points, its vulnerabilities, the specific geometry of a neck under controlled pressure. He was not a soldier. He was not an assassin by training or temperament. But he understood bodies. He went to the emperor's chambers. Commodus was weakened from the purging, disoriented, alone. The most powerful man in the world, on the last night of his calendar, in a room that had suddenly become very quiet. Narcissus put his hands around the emperor's throat in the bath. It did not take long. The palace was silent before dawn. Eclectus moved through the corridors with the practiced invisibility of a man who had spent decades learning which floors creaked and which guards could be trusted to look the other way. The body had been moved, the chamber secured. The night's events needed to become, for the next few hours, something that had not happened yet. By morning, they had a story. The emperor had died in his sleep, natural causes. A young man's body surrendering to... They would think of something. They had a few hours to think of something. What they actually had was a problem with several sharp edges. Killing the emperor was the easy part. What came after required a different kind of nerve entirely. The Praetorian Guard would need to be managed. The Senate would need to be told. A successor would need to be produced before the machinery of the empire, briefly leaderless, began to shake itself apart. They had already chosen the successor. Pertinax, a general, respected, competent, the kind of steady hand that Rome had been quietly starving for. He was waiting. He had been told. He was ready. The Senate was informed at first light. The reaction was not grief. Dio Cassius described senators who had survived 12 years of Commodus running through the streets in the early morning, pounding on each other's doors, laughing and weeping simultaneously. Men who had spent a decade chewing laurel leaves and memorizing new names for the months. They ran to the Senate House. They voted. The decrees came fast. The Senate had a procedure for this. It was called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. A formal legal process by which a person could be unmade retroactively. Not just killed, Not just disgraced, but erased, removed from the record, excised from the official history of the world as surgically as a name chiseled off a stone tablet. They voted it for Commodus within hours of learning he was dead. The work began immediately. Stonemasons moved through public spaces with chisels, removing his name from inscriptions. The months went back to their old names. January, February, the familiar rhythm restored. The city of Rome ceased to be Colonia Commodiana and became Rome again, as if the renaming had been a bad dream the city was only now shaking off. The statues came down. In the Senate House, in the forums, in the temples where he had installed images of himself as Hercules, they toppled them methodically, not in a frenzy, with the quiet efficiency of men who had been waiting a long time to do something useful with their hands. His face was removed from coins. His portraits were defaced. The official records were amended. But you cannot chisel a man out of 12 years. You cannot unmake the list, or the families it destroyed, or the senators who spent a decade pretending the months had new names. The marble could be smoothed. The memory of what it felt like to live inside his Rome, that stayed. It always stays. Here is the question history never asks cleanly. Commodus did not appear from nowhere. He was the product of a system, an inheritance system, a power system, a silence system that Rome had been building for generations. And the men who killed him, the ones who stepped into the gap he left, were not healers. Pertinax, the steady general they chose as successor, lasted 87 days before the Praetorian Guard murdered him for trying to enforce discipline. The Guard then auctioned the emperorship to the highest bidder, openly, in the camp. The empire for sale to whoever could write the largest number on a piece of parchment. This is what came after Commodus. Not recovery, acceleration. Sulla had marched his legions on Rome a century and a half earlier and shown the world that the city's institutions could be broken by one man with enough nerve. Caesar had confirmed it. Augustus had formalized it. Each generation inherited a system slightly more dependent on the character of a single person at its center and slightly less capable of surviving a bad one. Commodus was not an aberration. He was the logical endpoint of a very long chain of decisions made by men who believed the system was stronger than it was. And the Senate, those 900 men who used his names for the months and applauded in the sand and chewed their laurel leaves and survived, they had been part of it too. Every empire that falls from the inside looks, in hindsight, like it was always going to. The question is never who lit the fire. It is who built the room. Commodus was erased from the record within hours of his death. His name chiseled off stone, his months renamed, his city returned to Rome. But erasure is not the same as disappearing. 12 years of names on lists do not chisel off that easily. If you made it here, drop a comment with your city and country. Hit subscribe. Hit like. These are the stories the algorithm buries. This is the forgotten fuse. And the next one is worse.